It's really excited to bring you a brand new project from Thumbcoast TV. It's something we've been calling Around the Block. Many of you might remember me. I've done a lot of different programs over the years, and I did a lot of walking tours, especially back in COVID. That's now half a decade on. I can't believe it. But you know, this was always such a fun time to kind of walk around neighborhoods and see some of the history in our own backyard. Start right at my own garage right back there and walking here on 6th Street. And I thought we'd go back to kind of the original, one of my first routes. And we thought it was so appropriate to name our program Around the Block, because this was, for a lot of people, they remember of that program, was seeing the things around their own neighborhood, in their places where they've lived here in the Blue Water area. And I'm really excited to talk a little bit about some of the history. We'll talk about some of the architecture and get kind of off the beaten path. There's not a whole lot of people who might show you 6th Street, right? You know, this is one of those places. I think it's great. I obviously live nearby, but this is kind of the angle of history you don't often see. So, for example, if I turn things around here, just like that, take a look. So here we are on 6th Street. We got Military up there. Everybody drives down Military. Not a lot of people look at the backs of some of these buildings. And so I thought we could just take a little bit of a walk around the neighborhood, talk a little bit about the history of some of these beautiful homes and a little bit about some of the architectural style that you can see around the neighborhood, because you know, not everything might be on the cover of, you know, an Architectural Digest doesn't mean that's not, you know, still a beautiful home that has its own architectural elements and things like that over the years, and certainly its own history. I like this particular block. The sidewalk's over on this side for a little bit. It bounces around. It's one of those blocks. But I'm going to try and pick some themes for some of our walks, because there's obviously a lot of history, a lot of stories we can tell. But I thought a good one to start with would be the history and a little bit about one of my pet peeves. There is a term that gets thrown around a whole lot, and that term is Victorian. People talk about a Victorian house. And I think a lot of people have an idea of what a Victorian house is. You know, we see something like this over here, the back of two great big kind of monumental houses. They each have 3 floors, carriage houses, garages in the back, which are always an interesting addition in some of these homes built in like the 1880s and 1890s. And I think that's what a lot of people think of when they think of Victorian. Don't worry, we'll get to see the front. But I just don't like that term a ton, and let me tell you why. So we're coming up here, we're going to cross Oak and Griswold, because one house in particular I want to show you up here on the corner. So Queen Victoria comes to the throne in the United Kingdom, so already kind of weird that we refer to an era in American history by the ruler of another country, right? So Queen Victoria, though, she comes to the throne after basically a cousin of hers dies, you know, William the Fourth. And he, when William dies in 1837, there's no male to take the throne. So she becomes the Queen Victoria. And she would stay on that throne for an incredibly long time. She's right up there. We all lived through one of those queens who was queen for decades and decades and decades. Queen Elizabeth II. Victoria, same thing. So she was queen from 1837 all the way to 1901. And you know how much buildings and technology and places changed between 1837 and 1901? So this is a pretty nice kind of has some Queen Anne elements, and we'll talk about what that means as a subset style. Nice little Dutch gambrel roof over on some of these homes. So to call something Victorian just, you know, doesn't do it justice. It's not particularly accurate, because the things that can all technically be Victorian, well, take a look at this. This is my prime example. If we want to talk about one of the oldest houses in Port Huron, I got a pretty good nominee for you guys. Now, there's a lot of caveats, things like that. I always kind of like right here at 6th and Griswold, take a look over here. There's this great big hill. And they talk about this house being built back in the 1850s. That's a Victorian house, right? She's queen, 1850. You know, that's a Victorian house. We see the big turrets and gables over here, and we'll talk about that being very Victorian, right? Something people like to say, it's actually Queen Anne style architecture. But I think the oldest house, and it's been moved, might be this one right here on the corner. This house dates all the way back to the 1840s, which I think is pretty cool. So this was actually built for one of the soldiers at Fort Gratiot. You know what? We're going to walk across the street so we can get a really good view of this thing. So we'll make sure that don't get run over. Walk across here and take a look at this. It's always interesting when you see gaps. There was a whole house right here on this corner, sadly no longer with us. So take a look. Such an interesting little house we have here. So Fort Gratiot goes all the way back to 1814, was rebuilt in the 1820s, and it was active on and off until 1879. And so there were a lot of officers who lived there, and the officers could actually afford some nicer private residences. They didn't have to live in the barracks of the house or anything like that. And so this is one of these privately built homes for one of these officers who did pretty well with their standard of pay. And so in the 1840s, when this was built, this was Gothic Revival. And you can tell that Gothic Revival. Now, when you hear Gothic, a lot of people think of a big cathedral or Edgar Allan Poe or maybe even something else these days. Goth has a lot of different, terms, and it's kind of a loaded term these days with lots behind it. But that Gothic influence from the Middle Ages, you can see it here. This house doesn't have... Now, when we talk about high style, it doesn't mean that it doesn't have style. You're saying it just has no style. High style is just sometimes you find on larger homes where they have a little bit more money to spend on some of those embellishments. This is a little more vernacular. It's one of those fun architectural terms. And that just means kind of every day. Most people live in a vernacular house that has little bits of style. But look how it's asymmetrical. These two sharp peaks up here and the cross gable. Those are all elements. And take a look at that window. That window on the right there in particular, that is a Gothic window if I've ever seen one. So kind of neat to see some of those little details survive and see a house that's been moved. That used to be something they did a lot more frequently back in the 19th century than they do today. Today, they're as likely to tear down an old house as sneeze at it. But back in the 1840s, when you think about the energy that went into constructing something like this, all the workmanship, take a look at some more of the windows in the back. Another one of those pointed windows up in the gable, very Gothic. So this house has been moved here. So maybe not the oldest on its original location, but certainly one of the oldest in the entire city. And it's a Victorian house. It's every bit as much as Victorian as, say, this house right over here. Now, this house has a Queen Anne style. I think most people, when they see Queen Anne, they think Victorian. And, sometimes, as much as I miss the house that was here on this lot, it goes as a really good, clean picture on the side of the house. And Queen Anne is a really interesting style to a home. It's really pretty easy to identify. Queen Anne, they're usually very eclectic. They're usually pretty big in the massing, so the kind of general shape of the house. And they're usually asymmetrical. So you look at one from the front, and is one side the same as the other? Well, if they're not, that's a good indication it's asymmetrical. So I love this one. We've got a carousel horse right there on that corner, the big wraparound porch. It's very typical for one of these Queen Anne homes. One of the other things you can see is this has, so there are two terms that you used a lot, a turret and a tower. So towers go all the way to the ground. This one only starts on that second floor, so rather than a tower, that is a turret. So there you go. Now you know the difference between a tower and a turret. But some beautiful things. We can see lots of different shapes. We see the arch of that window. We see squares. We see triangles up in the gables. We even see a little tiny porch right up here. That little tiny porch, one of the kind of cool things. There's been a number of theories proposed for really why they exist. Get you a little bit of fresh air and maybe an air before air conditioning. But even more importantly, cool piece of technology, if you have huge carpets upstairs, and you need to clean them, you take them outside to beat them. Well, if you've ever dragged a carpet up or down a flight of steps, you know it's not easy. So people began in the 1880s and 90s when carpeting became popular, but before vacuum cleaners were, adding these little porches so you could take your carpet outside. So who'd have thought that your chores would influence the shape of your house? And you know, it's frequent that you see a lot of homes in the same neighborhood bearing a lot of hallmarks of the same kind of style. This is another good example of some Queen Anne. It doesn't have third story, but it's got some beautiful, these are called little dentils in here, the triangular pediment with all this gingerbread is sometimes called, or barrage boards. So some really neat things. And here we have another example of a turret rather than maybe a tower, because it doesn't go all the way down to that first floor. Some beautiful clapboard. Now we see tons and tons of these houses in Port Huron. They're always very difficult to maintain, and we can even see some here on the other side of the street as well. Take a look. This one, now that is a tower, right? That corner conical shaped thing sticking off the side of the house, that is a tower because it goes all the way down to that second floor. So look at all of that, all of those examples that you can see in just a couple of blocks. But take a look at all those different windows, all those different shapes, and it's a lot, right? So today, I think a lot of people think these are very beautiful homes. Got another couple we're gonna see and walk past here as we turn right up there on Military. But what's amazing is when you think about the history of buildings, it's in the 1930s, you know, people's tastes change. So a lot of these are built in the 1870s, the 1880s, 1890s. It's in the 1920s. It's in the 1920s and the 1930s that many of these are torn down. People just thought they were gaudy, thought it was too much. And people really didn't like maintenance. You know how long it takes to paint all of these different colors, all of these intricate little details that really make a house and really make it stand out. So to give everybody an idea where we are, is this something everybody in St. Clair County has driven past here, I'm sure at least once. We're out here on Military, right? There's Buscemi's, we got the ladies, Women's Life down there. Deep in the background, we have the Harrington. We're by the YMCA and the Hawk Shop. But we're gonna, again, kind of spin things around here and take a look at some of the beautiful homes we can see here. Again, Queen Anne, look at all that, the round half moon. We see multiple entrances. It's very asymmetrical. Bay windows, oriel windows, all sorts of very intricate detail that became popular. You know, the weird thing is, we talk about naming things after foreign monarchs, where again, Victorian, I don't think is a great descriptor for a house like this, because the Victorian era is just so long. We call them Queen Anne homes, and they have absolutely nothing to do with Queen Anne at all. Queen Anne was Queen of the United Kingdom back when they became the United Kingdom, back the early part of the 18th century. So she was right before the Georgian era, where they have to eventually, when she dies, they find a cousin, George the First. He speaks German. He wasn't even from the UK. So pretty wild to think about. Here we have the old Ally Center here, formerly the Atrium, the Blue Water Ally Center. They've done some amazing, beautiful work inside. And take a look at that nice kind of fall sunset. It's maybe not as vibrant as you see in the middle of the summer, but it is a beautiful fall day. And that's how you know, seeing a fall sunset, that this was recorded at like 4:30 in the afternoon, right? That's the time that we're looking at over here. There are some other great 19th century homes over here on the other side of the street that are, again, a little bit more vernacular in style, which just means they don't have all of the detailing that you always see in kind of the high-end homes. But Military, here's where a lot of the movers and shakers lived in the 1880s and 1890s, so where a lot of money was invested into these homes. Many of them now, there are quite a few single family, but many are also apartments, duplexes, even triplexes. So we have a little bit more density, which is, I always think, good. Maybe that's a soapbox thing, but we always want to see more people. And the more homes you have, usually the cheaper they are. here we have another two of my absolute favorite homes. So these are immaculately maintained. Here we can see the great big porch on this home. This is a very Greek revival kind of thing going on here. So we can see how much it looks like a Greek temple front. And just next door, oh, there's our old friend. There's a tower again going all the way down and nicely complemented by the little gazebo kind of looking thing in the corner of the wraparound porch. Another great example of a Queen Anne home from the 1880s and 1890s, and of course a complimentary carriage house back there. No one had a car in the 1880s or 1890s, at least not in Port Huron. So the carriage house truly was for a carriage, right? So something you're going to see at that time. Here we can see one of those duplexes that's actually built as a duplex. So sometimes those older homes are even built with that density in mind. Another great example of kind of a Queen Anne with maybe not every single piece of style on there, every single accoutrement that you could add. Sometimes less is more, you know, it can all be depending on what you like. On the corner across the way, we have a great kind of craftsman looking building. These were the buildings in the house style that would actually take over after Queen Anne. We're going to spend a whole video someday talking about the arts and crafts movement and what the social structures, how that changed, what houses looked like, how we interacted with houses. But we're talking all about Queen Anne today. And boom, if you want another great example, these are both Victorian, right? But they look how different they look. So the Davison house here, absolutely Queen Anne. We see the polychrome paint scheme. One of the kind of neat things about that, it was in the 1880s that they had invented color fast, stable paint that you could go into a paint store and say, hey, I want pink number 3 and blue number 2. And it would be the same every time. So you could make these very intricate schemes and not have to worry about the paint matching anymore, which was always a trouble if you had to hand mix it. So very much Queen Anne with the big porch, some asymmetry, and the ornate shingling. I like the flat shingles there and different patterns all throughout. It's a lot of maintenance to keep that up. And here we can see the Davison house even has one of these beautiful state historic markers. The Queen Anne style home completed in 1890, the residence of Wilbur F. Davison till his death in 1913. So it's a fun, kind of interesting story. When he would die, his son, who was just 10 years old, would wind up, his ex-wife would marry the man who was living at my house, just a couple houses down where we started. So the Davison family bounced around, and Wilbur Davison, his son, would go on to a much longer life. And here's one of these more famous homes in Port Huron. This one is, of course, affectionately called the Castle. But this is a style we'd call Norman Revival. The Norman Revival, it's a kind of a simple castle like this. We see all sorts of different things. We see the little loopholes that are kind of copies of original castles. And of course, in the original castle, all of this would be done for defensive purposes, right? You know, you want to be able to defend your home. You have crenellations, you have holes where you can shoot bows and arrows and crossbows out of. Hopefully no one has to defend their house with a crossbow today, but we can see where they take that style from. I'm so glad they finally took down a few of the trees. It had gotten maybe a little overgrown, and we couldn't see that architectural masterpiece from the 1890s. And this one was a home for a long time, but was eventually used as the Port Huron Business College, which is pretty cool. We can even step around and kind of see the side of the building over here, where we can see the great big arched entranceway, which is kind of a Richardsonian Romanesque style. But again, it's Norman Revival, also Victorian, right? You see a house like this is much more kind of craftsman. This is like a 1920s home. So a different style altogether. Again, this is the headquarters for the United Way. Although it's asymmetrical, there's a few more offices on this side than on this side. That does not make it Queen Anne. There's a number of those diagnostic pieces you can look at. Sometimes Queen Anne homes, especially over the years, over the now, century and a half that some of them are old, will lose a lot of their ornamentation. And a great example of that is right here. This is an apartment complex, and I'm sure they're nice apartments to live in. I have some great neighbors, but they over the years have lost some of the gingerbread, the pieces. The entire place has been clad The original wood clapboard has been covered. That was something that would take a lot of maintenance to deal with. And so you put like an asbestos slate tile, and all of a sudden you got the homestead apartments. You can actually, if you ever stop by and take a peek in even the front windows here, you can still see some of the beautiful original stairways inside, kind of the beautiful massing. You can still see that asymmetry with a couple of stacked bay windows over here. And just some of the little details, I think, that have gotten covered up over the years. And obviously they've gone back to the single paint scheme, because when you put on that, vinyl siding, you don't have to paint it anymore. So not very labor intensive. I'm sure maybe we'll do an entire episode or something sometime about the Frank D. Jenks house. So Frank D. Jenks built this house all the way back in the 1880s, definitely Queen Anne, and my house also had that tile. We removed that asbestos tile and restored the original clapboard. It's always kind of a work in progress. But what I wanted to end today with is talking about across the street. There's just an absolutely gorgeous home, no matter which way you slice it. And this is the Jenkinson house. Sometimes it's called the Jenkinson Cady house or Jenkinson Cady Sikori house. It's all the work that Lynn Sikori put in restoring this beautiful home. So we're going to talk just a little bit about it. It is literally a textbook Queen Anne. Right, so this is, I've seen this in like architectural textbooks to talk about what a Queen Anne home is supposed to look like. And this is it. This is as good as it gets for sure. So this home actually had an architect. A lot of homes might not have an architect, right? They might just have a house builder or a home builder who can knock together houses. They do an excellent job. I had an uncle who was a house builder, but he wasn't an architect, right? So he can follow a set of plans. He's not going to maybe create his own. But this one was an architect, George Garnsey, and this design was called the Hyde Park Villa. And it was a Chicago architect, and there's 3 of these. No 2 of them are exactly the same. We can even look kind of over on the side. There's a nice little porche cochere. So that's the little side entranceway, a covered area. So if you were getting dropped off on, your carriage and it was raining out, you could avoid getting soaking wet or anything like that. So very nice. There's a little guest house and pool house in the back as well. It isn't quite original to the home, but a very nice addition. So there are 3 of these, as I mentioned, one in Chicago, one in Wisconsin, and one right here in Port Huron. So the first guy who built this, John Jenkinson, was a lumber dealer, and he lists his job as simply architect, which I think, as capitalist, which I think is really funny. He lists his job simply as capitalist, which I think is really funny. So his first house burned down in 1888, and he lived over on Lapeer, decided this was the up-and-coming area in town. And so put a lot of money into this. He died in 1904. His family actually never made it over here to occupy the home, so he had a couple places to live. Albert Stevenson, who founded the International Order of Foresters and the German-American Savings Bank, he lived here from 1907 to 1918. So his brother was actually mayor of Port Huron. And then Bert Cady was a very prominent politician. He was a state senator, postmaster. He was a long-time City of Port Huron city attorney. He did a lot. He was the Republican Party chair for the state of Michigan back in the 30s and 40s. And he would live here until 1949. One of the coolest things is in the 1920s, he would actually host former President William Howard Taft here at the home. When he would come on a campaign stop to town. One of those kind of interesting trivia facts, at least to me in Port Huron, is that in the entire history of the city, we've never had a visit from a sitting president. So the former presidents, the people have gone on to become president, but never a sitting president. And one of the closest we got was, of course, President Taft. So this is another example where the home next door sadly is gone, so we have kind of a large field there, but it does allow us, again, another look at this beautiful, we see they have a turret here with that kind of onion dome right there on the corner of the house. And The Sicory family, Lynn Sicory, an amazing preservationist. You couldn't ask for better for the city. She did so much work. Long-term advocate, chair of the Historic District Commission, helped found that commission to save many of our historic homes. Well, we owe a huge debt of gratitude to Lynn for sure, because the amount of work that she put in to saving and preserving our history is just great. And so, you know, sadly she has passed away, but I think her legacy survives in many ways. And one of them is, of course, the amazing historic homes we have in our community. And I am blessed and honored to get to live across from one of the works that she spent so much time on, her own home. And I'll never forget, you know, when I was painting my house, Lynn came over and she wasn't sold on the color. She told me she didn't like it. She wasn't one to mince words. But eventually she said, you know, actually it turned out pretty good. I like the way this looks. And that meant more to me than just about anything else in the world, to know that my neighbor liked my house when I knew how much she knew about historic buildings and cared about them. But I hope that you found this at least a little interesting. You know, we've been walking out and about 25 minutes or so, just looking at just things in a couple of blocks. You know, this was really not a strenuous walk by any means. I really enjoyed it. It's a beautiful night out. You know, I couldn't, if every day could be like today, it's in the 60s, fall weather, love it. But I hope that you enjoyed this. I think we're going to do a lot more of these. We got lots more historical stories to tell. We have more architecture to investigate. And we're going to go over the entire kind of Blue Water Thumb Coast area, because we're with Thumb Coast TV now. So I'm so excited to get to say that. So I think I'll sign off for this week, for this episode. And thank you guys again so much for coming with me. I'm Andrew Kircher for Thumb Coast TV. Thanks for coming with me around the block. Until next time.